Hello, welcome. Before I introduce this week's guest, I just want to take a moment to share a recommendation with you. If you struggle with making important decisions, there's a really inspiring book that I'd invite you to check out. It's called The Necktie and the Jaguar, and it's by retired clinical psychologist, Jungian analyst, and shamanic practitioner Carl Greer. In addition to revealing how he tapped into the wisdom and power of unseen worlds for guidance and inspiration, his fascinating memoir offers some really valuable keys and questions that inspire the kind of thinking that will guide you effortlessly on your own path to transformation. Check it out for yourself at carlgreer.com. And now, joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books that influenced him the most on his life journey is Mark Anthony, JD, aka the Psychic Lawyer. A little bit about Mark. He's a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits. He's an Oxford-educated trials attorney. He's appeared on numerous high-ranking TV and radio shows and is the author of some groundbreaking and critically acclaimed spiritual bestsellers, including Never Letting Go, Heal Grief with Help from the Other Side, and Evidence of Eternity, Communicating with Spirits for Proof of the Afterlife. Sorry, that's the Afterlife Frequency, which is his latest book, The Scientific Proof of Spiritual Contact and How That Awareness Will Change Your Life. I'm getting his books all mixed up here. But we've got a little scoop for you tonight because this book has only been out for about 2 weeks and already it's on the bestseller list. And I think we've been told, Mark Anthony, that it's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, it's been submitted for a Pulitzer.
Submitted.
Yeah,
submitted.
Apparently, I received the notification from Columbia University, and so I had to double check, make sure that one of my friends weren't, and they verified that it's been submitted. So whoever did that, thank you very much. And
wow.
And so there's a whole process that goes through, but just the fact that it is being considered is such an honor. And then a couple of days ago, we were talking about this before the interview began. Shirley MacLaine, the film legend, award-winning actress, spiritual leader, New York Times bestselling author, in her newsletter, The Shirleygram, she stated, "I recommend The Afterlife Frequency by Mark Anthony," and she said some really, really wonderful things about it. So, I mean, the book officially was released October 12th, and I'm just so humbled and honored by the response. So thank you, everyone, for your support, for your love. Thank you so much.
Well, this is a book that you and I had a conversation on the radio show about a few weeks ago, and I have to say, anyone who watches this show knows that I read a lot of books. It's my job. It's also my passion. And I've read a lot of books on afterlife communication, but yours is the one that I've been waiting for because yours is the one with the evidence and the science of how it works. So, I'm a big fan of this book, and I think it's about time that a book like this became a top seller, and to get it, submitted even, that must be a first for a book of this nature.
Actually, my last book, Evidence of Eternity, I understand it too had been submitted. So, and from my understanding, that was the first book of the genre. So this is maybe the second or third time a book in this genre has been submitted in the nonfiction category. So somebody out there likes the way I write, and I appreciate that. And it is quite unusual for a book of a spiritual nature to be considered in these realms, And then when I asked the world's top near-death experience researchers and survival of consciousness experts to review the book, the endorsements that I got were very, because, you work on something, and I developed my theories. I did my research. I spent years on this, and I submitted it to scientists like Dr. Dean Radin, the chief scientist at Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dr. Gary Schwartz, the head of parapsychology, psychology, physics. I mean, Gary's got 2 PhDs in University of Arizona. Dr. Bruce Grayson, the head of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Kevin Tedeschi from the Edgar Cayce Association. Colonel Dr. John Alexander, former head of the U.S. military's UFO project, a totally no-nonsense guy. I mean, I could go on and on. And the response that I got was like they love it, they approve it, they agree with it. It coincides with their research. So this has been very, very exciting. And what I wanted to do, Sandie, is explain spirit communication, the different forms of it, because I call this interdimensional communication. We live in this dimension. The other side, the afterlife, is another dimension. And traditionally, the different forms of spirit communication through a medium or direct contact. Maybe you have a dream, a visitation that feels real, or you feel that you see a loved one's presence, a near-death experience, a shared death experience, out-of-body experiences, deathbed visions. They've all been treated as separate phenomenon. And my research and my life's work as a medium, I'm seeing that no, they're not. There is a common denominator between them, which is energy transfer and frequency alignment. And so that all of this can be explained on sound scientific principles through quantum physics. And it is time that we look at it this way, instead of, gee, I don't know how this happens, it's hocus pocus, it's pseudoscience. No. And I get this from my father. He was a NASA engineer, a US Navy SEAL, and he had mediumistic ability. And when I was 8 years old, Sandie, my dad and I were looking at the stars. And I loved my dad. He was my hero. He worked with astronauts. I was 8 years old. I mean, he was just the best. And he said to me, he goes, Mark, there's no such thing as a mystery. There's only a question for which we do not yet have the answer. But if enough research, enough funding, and enough focus is put into any question, we will find the answer, and it will be based on science. And so that's what began this whole journey, which has led to me writing the Afterlife Frequency.
Wow. Well, we will be getting deeper into the book later on, because it's too good not to tell people about. And I do want to share a few stories from it as well. For now, let's look at your 10 best books, the books that inspired you the most on your life journey. And my first question to you, normally I ask people what turned on their light, but as a 4th generation psychic, you came in with your light turned on, didn't you?
Yeah, it's definitely in the DNA. Both mom and dad had these abilities. It runs for generations on both sides of the family. And then, dad was always, there's an answer for everything. And my mother was just wonderful, just amazingly gifted, philosophical, funny as all get up, tough as nails. And so at our dinner table, we'd have discussions that inevitably would lead into spirituality and metaphysics. So in one conversation, we could discuss Jesus, Buddha, quantum physics, and Gandhi all before we finished our salad. So it's just been part of me from day one.
Yeah. And you've always been in pursuit of knowledge, haven't you? You started reading at the age of 4. Yeah. And so, yeah. Okay. Well, tell me, what must it have been like for you? What was it like for you, having to being such an explorer, being so curious and a book lover, having to distill your list down to just 10?
It was hard. Because, I'm interested in so many different things. I love history. I love philosophy. I love theology. I love archaeology. I love quantum physics. I love marine biology, anatomy and physiology. And I think, Sandie, that's one of the reasons I was drawn to the practice of law. Initially, I wanted to be in the clergy, which is not unusual for a medium. But what I like about law is, and not that I'm siding with that, but there was this movie probably about 20 years ago called The Devil's Advocate. And it was Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino. And Al Pacino was the head of this law firm, but he ends up being Satan or whatever. And Keanu Reeves is like, why? Why the law? And he goes, because it puts us in everything, the way Al Pacino does, and it's true. In my study of law, it nourished and augmented my love for all these different subjects, because I was a prosecutor. Then I switched over to criminal defense, and then to complex civil litigation and head injury, brain injury litigation. And so I had to deal with forensics, with quantum physicists, with neuroscientists, neurobiologists, microbiologists. I mean, I had to deal with all of this, and you have to learn it, because how can I possibly do a deposition of an opposing expert or put my expert witness on the witness stand unless I understand this? And so I used to eat that up. And so that's always been part of me, is I just like to learn about things.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've read very widely read. Yeah. Well, let's start with your first book, which actually is a novel. And it is The Source by James Michener, published in 1965. What was it about that book that you really enjoyed so much?
It was archaeology and it was theology rolled into one. And I've always been interested in archaeology, particularly Egyptology. But at any rate, what I loved about The Source is it combined history, archaeology, theology, and really good storytelling. The tough part about it, and I remember when I picked up the book, and it's typical of Michener, it was like 900 pages, something like that. And somebody told me, you got to give it 50 pages. All right. And the first 50 pages are going to be kind of tough. And boy, were they right, because by page 51, 52, I could not put this down. And the basic premise is that these archaeologists are excavating a site in modern day Israel. And it's at a well that they call the Source, which it has multiple meanings. And they dig down several levels, like you do in an archaeological site, and they find certain artifacts. So, for example, they dig down to the deepest level, it's like level 13 or 14, and they find a flint sickle. And the archaeologists are discussing it. There's like a team of 4 or 5 archaeologists, and they say, well, this apparently came from the Neolithic era. Looks like it's about 6,000 years ago. And then the next page, there we are with the cavemen. And it tells their story from their perspective and how that object was dropped or lost. And then coinciding with this is the development of the concept of God. There's this one hill that this one caveman, every time he goes to it, he gets this feeling, this sensation. And then a couple other levels were about 4,000 BC, and they're worshiping the god Baal. And part of that is human sacrifice, which is of children. And so, they find another artifact, and then it goes all the way up. The Roman period, that is one of the most gripping stories, because they find a Roman coin, and this city resisted the Roman Empire. And the description of the Roman army approaching and besieging the city, and then the fate of the defenders. And then the last archaeological find was during the medieval era. And it was a group of crusaders who were holding out against the Turks. And what's really fascinating is, as this book weaves its stories, you see how the development of belief in God goes from, I get this strange feeling on a mountain, to belief in the Old Testament God, the evolution into Christianity, how it became really a Greek thing, not a Jewish thing, how the Romans came in, and then the rise of Islam and the conflict. And it was interesting because they don't paint the Muslims as bad guys or the Christians as good guys or this. They give it. Michener does a wonderful job of giving everyone their say. And then, and it's a spoiler alert, in the final chapter, you realize that the 5 archaeologists are all, and they don't realize this, but the reader does. So Michener kind of lets you in on the secret. They're all descendants of various characters from throughout this time. So I always felt that that was one of, if not the best novels that I ever read, because it was so compelling. It was very typical of Michener. He researched things to the point of exhaustion, but his storytelling is second to none.
So it's kind of faction, not fiction.
Yeah,
because he's woven so much in.
And that was a big influence on how I write, because I interject a lot of history and a lot of my own personal experiences. And like, you know, when I write about historical figures, I just don't want to, and King so-and-so did this. I want to tell it like how that person was feeling. And, you know, or rather, you know, try to get the reader to connect to it. And so Michener, I recommend anyone who wants to write a really good story. I think Michener is a perfect example.
So you've used him as a little bit of a kind of mentor coach for your own writing.
Yes. And, you know, I almost met him. I was in Bangkok years ago, and I understand he was at this hotel called the Hotel Orient. And I really wanted to stay there because I was hoping, like, you know, maybe I'd run into him. But I was not able to get a room there. And anyway, so I almost met James Michener as he was working on his last novel before he died.
Yeah. As a medium, as a psychic, when you're reading a book like that, do you find yourself tapping in to those eras and getting your own information as well?
Yes. I've always had, well, I believe in reincarnation. I reference it in the Afterlife Frequency, and in my last book, I wrote a chapter on it. And also as a near-death experience researcher, pretty much everyone who has an NDE returns from the experience, myself included, believing in reincarnation. And, you know, one of the symptoms, if you will, of reincarnation is identifying with particular eras throughout history. You know, but I try not to jump to conclusions. But when I read a book like that, I certainly identify with areas. It's also one of the reasons why I've spent so much of my life and my free time, vacation time, if you will, traveling to these mystical and spiritual sites. You know, I mean, I've been all over the place, and, you know, there's still more that I want to get to. And some areas I really feel a resonance with. And yes, so to answer your question directly, absolutely yes.
Yeah. Well, book number 2 is quite different. This was written by the iconic Joseph Campbell, Myths to Live By. So how did that book impact you?
When I was in college, I minored in religion, and Joseph Campbell, this book was required reading, but only a couple chapters. Well, I read the whole thing a couple times. And what I like about Joseph Campbell is he explains to us how myths, how belief in deities and a higher power is extremely important. And I love the way he explains, particularly Greco-Roman mythology. You know, at one time, you know, that was as deeply held, you know, beliefs for people in that part of the world in those eras as the Gospels are for people here. And that, you know, we hear about all these different myths about, oh, you know, when Icarus flew too close to the sun and, you know, he fell and all this. But then when you begin to examine them beyond the obvious and understand what the metaphor means and what what it's teaching us, it showed me that these stories are important to us as human beings. They go to our very psyche. The Greeks understood human psychology on such a complex level. It's mind blowing. And so through all these myths and legends, whether they're Greek or Hindu or Norse or Christian or Native American, these are important stories. These are important lessons. You have the heroes, but the heroes always have their Achilles heel, if you will. But they're also very human people with flaws. And all of these stories, these myths, teach us things about ourselves. And so they're lessons to help us grow emotionally, spiritually, physically, and mentally.
What is it about a book that gives you the most satisfaction? I mean, for me, it's if I read a book and it tells me something I didn't know, or it opens up something so that my perceptions really shift, then it's really satisfying. What is that for you? What does a book have to do?
I tend to agree. Learning something I didn't know, there's a resonance. If I'm reading the book and all of a sudden I feel like I'm there, particularly with books of a historical nature, and it has to be engaging and entertaining. Like I picked up some books about history that I love, and it's like in law school reading extremely boring books like the Federal Basic Income Tax Code, something like that. It's just a drudgery. So I think that when an author can take any subject and make it engaging, that's when I want to read the book. So if I'm in a bookstore and I see a book that maybe I'm interested in, I'll just open up any page and I'll read a paragraph. And if I like that paragraph and it reads like it just flows, I bought the book.
Well, book number 3 on your list was by the father of the modern near-death experience movement, Dr. Raymond Moody, and the book, no surprise, Life After Life.
I've gotten to know Dr. Moody as a colleague and as a friend, and talk about an honor, but I was certainly aware of his work for years before I ever met him. And Life After Life, I remember reading it. I was probably a teenager, and what struck me was in near-death experiences, people who die and their consciousness leaves their body and they go through a tunnel into the light, that Christians would many times encounter what they believe to be Jesus. Hindus would encounter Shiva and Vishnu, Krishna. And I'm like, well, why aren't they seeing the same thing? And then I realized they are. It's just that their finite brain, as we're transitioning from a finite means of perception to an infinite, we put a filter on there because, as Joseph Campbell has explained, we've created these myths or these archetypes so that we have a point of reference to relate to. And what I love about Life After Life is that Dr. Raymond Moody, for thousands of years, there have been recorded accounts of people who've died, and then they came back to life with tales of this transcendent realm. And so these resurrections, nobody knew what to call them. They baffled historians, baffled religious experts, medical experts. Nobody even knew what to call it until Raymond Moody called it a near-death experience, because you die, you get as near to death being a permanent state, at least in the physical sense. And it's like being on a rubber band, you're born and then you touch that afterlife frequency and then it pulls you back and you're able to give these accounts. And so I just absolutely love that. Plus, it helped me understand my near-death experience. My father had 2 near-death experiences. My mother had a near-death experience. And, we talk about these, and it gave us a better understanding of what the heck was that.
So how did your near-death experience change you?
Well, I was 4. So, because people say, well, did you have a life review? It's like, well, what? I didn't like that sippy cup, but I like the other one better. But it always gave me this very... My father and mother always said, they go, you know, we had 3 kids, but you were difficult, but not in a behavioral way, because you would come out with these statements, these questions, these insights. And I'm pretty sure that that had a lot to do with my near-death experience. You know, you know, I mean, I was a kid and I wanted to, you know, do stuff that kids do, but it gave me this view that there's so much more than the physical. There's so much more than what our 5 physical senses can perceive.
So that's why you chose the Forever Angels near-death experiences in childhood and their lifelong impact by PMH Atwater.
Yes,
as
and
one of your books.
She's well. First off, yeah, that helped me a lot, and
Yeah.
I actually found that book after I met PMH Atwater. We were both speaking at the Edgar Cayce Association's Ancient Mysteries Conference, and she and her husband came up and she goes, "I remember you from IANS," and I said, "Oh yeah, I remember seeing you too," and she was so sweet. And I said, "Well, I had an NDE," and she started asking me questions about it. And she goes, "Yeah, you show all the symptoms of it." And so I had to get her book and read it, and it rocked my world. It gave me such a great understanding, because, you know, my childhood was, I had very loving parents. I always felt loved, which not every person does, not every child does. And if I'm thankful for many things, but more than anything for the parents that I had. But my childhood was unusual because where other kids were reading the Hardy Boys, you know, I'm reading, you know, Mutiny on the Bounty and, you know, and War and Peace and stuff like this. And Forever Angels helped me to reconcile my NDE with my childhood and into the adult that I've become. And PMH Atwater is such a warm and loving person, and it translates right into her writing. I mean, when you talk to her, and I was honored to interview her on my show, The Psychic and the Doc, recently, and it was just great being able to talk to her and to have that warmth. And she's such a loving and caring person, and she spent so much time interviewing children with NDEs. Now, I was lucky. Mom and Dad understood what happened to me, but there's a lot of children that have a near-death experience, and their parents, "Oh, you're hallucinating. Oh, it's the effect of a dying brain. Don't think about it. Just put it out of your mind." And that's not how to deal with something like that.
Yeah. PMH, I've interviewed her several times. She's absolutely delightful. And one of my favorite books is Future Memory, which is really about her near-death experiences and how that changed her. And, you know, she's such an unusual person. And I put this down to her having had the near-death experiences, that she's got this incredible innocence about her. And she's very childlike in the best, you know, she takes joy in everything. You know, she takes pleasure in everything, and she's not afraid to express it.
No, you know, and she has this childlike joy, the joie de vivre.
Yes.
Yet then there's this depth and wisdom. She's kind of like, on the surface, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, but behind the veil, Galadriel from Lord of the Rings.
Yes. Yeah. Good description. You should tell her that. She'd hoot with laughter.
I will. I know she's gonna. I got to remember that one.
Yeah. So book 5, again, this is fiction, and my God, what a piece of fiction. I don't know anybody who hasn't read The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I just referenced Galadriel, I guess, so that was a good segue to this. J.R.R. Tolkien was a deeply religious or man of faith. He was very Catholic, which is interesting because he taught at both Cambridge and Oxford. You'd think he'd be all very Church of England, but he was Catholic. And he wove into the stories. You can tell that he was heavily influenced by his spiritual beliefs, but also by Norse mythology. I mean, you know, the orcs, the dwarves, the elves. I mean, that's straight out of Norse mythology, but he did his spin on it. And I mean, it is in many ways considered the greatest work of fiction of the 20th century. And I just, all the characters, let me explain it like this. Let's look at it from the hobbits. Obviously, he takes the hobbits' viewpoint. And the hobbits, of course, Frodo ends up with the ring. And the ring is the embodiment of power, and absolute power, which corrupts absolutely. It is great evil. And so they got to destroy it. I think, everybody's read the books or seen the movie. And there's this one scene, it's actually in the first book, the Fellowship of the Ring. It's in the director's cut of the movie, but it was one that I really, really honed in on in the first book. Sam and Frodo, as they're leaving the Shire to go on this incredible adventure, they see a group of elves that are leaving the Shire. And Sam says, "It makes me sad. I don't know why." And when you look at it, the hobbits are us. And they're very, very childlike, and they like to eat, they like to plant things, they like to, they like to party. But all of a sudden, this small group of hobbits is thrown into this adventure. The elves represent the magic, the mystery, the wonder in our lives, yet they're leaving. Think about it as we grow older. Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny, Santa Claus. They're wonderful. I remember being a little kid, and I was like, well, are they really real? But I wanted to believe in them because I like that mystical. And then when you're a medium, it makes it even more. But as you get older, these things fade from your life. And that was one of the beautiful lessons, that life is difficult, it's painful, it involves change and adversity, but we grow in response to change and adversity. And the mystical and the magical of the elves fades to give way to personal responsibility and to taking account of our own actions. Then, and I used to bring this up to a lot of my youthful clients when I was practicing criminal offense, I'd always ask them, especially the ones that were arrested for alcoholism and drugs. I remember I was talking to this one kid, and he says, "Oh, well, I really like my crystal meth, and I really like this." And I said, "Do you ever see Lord of the Rings?" "Yeah." I go, "Gollum." "Yeah, Gollum, sitting in the cave all alone with my precious." He goes, "Yeah." I go, "What do you think the precious is?" He goes, "What do you mean? You love crystal meth, don't you?" He said, "Yeah." "And what has it done for you? Hasn't it isolated you from all your family and your friends? Don't you sit alone in your apartment, just you and your precious? Doesn't it mean more to you than anything? Look at Gollum. He's shrunk and he's shriveled." I said, "Peter Jackson modeled the character on a 65-year-old heroin addict. What do you think you're going to look like in 30 years? And this kid's eyes got really big. He goes, "Oh my God, I'm Gollum." I said, "Well, that's because that's what the ring represents. People think they can control this addiction. You can't control addiction. It will control you unless you take steps to turn to your friends, turn to your family to dispel of this." I mean, we could go on and on and on about the Lord of the Rings, but that's what captivated me. I remember I was 12 years old when I found Lord of the Rings. And I read it before I read The Hobbit. And then I went back and read The Hobbit. I was like, yeah, that's nice. And I went back and read The Lord of the Rings again. And there are so many powerful metaphors. And this ties in, like, once again, with Joseph Campbell. J.R.R. Tolkien created an entire universe. In fact, the languages, the Elvish, the Dwarvish, the Orcish, all those languages work. Yeah. They're real languages. Yeah, I mean, he created this. And it's just fascinating. So he, like James Michener, was an incredible inspiration to me in how to write spellbinding stories.
Yeah. I should imagine that every author would love to be able to write like Tolkien and have the success that Tolkien had. What a legacy. Book number 6, Byzantium. John Julius Norwich, published in 1988, and it's a trilogy about the Byzantium Empire.
John Julius Norwich is one of my favorite historical authors, and when you read it, you can't help snickering now and again. It's like, if John Cleese were teaching a history class, this would be it. And the way he tells a great story, and the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and when the western half collapsed, the eastern half, which was centered on Greece and what is now Turkey, survived pretty much for another 1,000 years. And so much of our culture was preserved and saved by Byzantium, because when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, libraries were ransacked and burned and looted, but the learning, the knowledge, the repository of thousands of years of knowledge continued. And John Julius Norwich brings a very shadowy and, for the most part, unknown civilization to light for us. And the way he describes the characters, the various emperors and the generals, and I think particularly during the Crusades, because the Crusades were started because of the Byzantines. They were defeated really badly in the year 1071. A Byzantine army of about 60, 70,000 men was destroyed by a Turkish army in what is now eastern Turkey. And the Byzantines appealed to the Pope for mercenaries. Apparently, they did too good of a job, because it turned into a religious fervor. The Byzantine emperors only wanted to augment their armies with mercenaries. Instead, what they got was the Crusades. And then you have these Byzantine emperors. They spoke Greek, Latin, they were cultured, they could, read. And then all of a sudden, all these thugs from Western Europe, from the medieval era, these kings who couldn't even write their own names, and the Byzantines had to, be pleasant about it. And the way John Julius Norwich describes their interaction and brings these people that most of whom we haven't heard anything about to life is just amazing. So this is history written as if it's a juicy novel.
Book number 7, talking about the Holy Land and the Crusades and religion. Book number 7 is the Holy Bible.
Absolutely. Talk about a controversial book. And I remember about 15 years ago, there was a movie, I think, called The Book of Eli. And long story short, it was this blind man who said he knew this book. And all the Bibles in the world had been destroyed, and he had the Bible memorized. And there was a line, I think, if memory serves me, Samuel L. Jackson played him, and he's just a great actor. And he said, many people think the world would be better off if this book had been destroyed. And I'm not saying that, okay? So I'm not saying it to offend anybody. But the thing is, the Bible has impacted us for the better part of the last 2,000 years in so many ways. Now, my take on the Bible is I look at it more as metaphor. And the reason that I do that is because when you look at the teachings of Jesus, Jesus taught by using parables. And parables are a story that, a fictional story that people can relate to, okay? Like the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the foolish bridesmaids and the wise bridesmaids, and you can go on. And I think that the Bible is largely metaphor, but I think there's a lot of factual references in there, like certainly Ramses, Herod, Pontius Pilate. They found, archaeologists did discover archaeological evidence, the name Pontius Pilatus in the excavation of Caesarea, which is a port in Israel. So there certainly a lot of people who did exist are chronicled in the Bible. And it's such a source of inspiration. Many people say that, the Bible says mediums are all bad, but when you look at a couple different passages, such as Romans 12 verse 6, that we all have gifts from God, and if your gift is one of prophecy, then prophesize in accordance with your faith. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 through 12, that we all have different gifts from God. To one is the gift of prophecy, to the other, discernment of spirits. Well, that's what mediumship is the discernment of spirits. And so there are many passages in the Bible in support of spirit communication, in support of prophecy. Now, there's other passages that are against this, but I think that we can't take a salad bar approach to the Bible. You've got to look at it as a stew and take all of it, but also be careful, because I mean, there's passages that say that if your daughter in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, if your daughter is menstruating and enters a temple, she shall be put to death. If your neighbor works on the Sabbath, he shall be put to death. I mean, we could go on with that. Certainly don't take those seriously. Look at it in the time, especially with like eating kosher. If you eat kosher in a pre-refrigeration society, it will keep you alive. Okay, you don't eat shellfish. Why? Because it goes bad. It gives you food poisoning. You don't eat pork. Why? Because of trichinosis. You don't, mix dairy and other products because it will, give you food poisoning. And so if you just say that, you got to eat this way, people won't. But when God tells you, then it becomes a whole different story. But the thing is, there's so many beautiful teachings in the Bible. I read it all the time. Near-death experiences are chronicled in the Bible. Paul, when he falls from his horse, okay, on the way to Tarsus, and then he says, I know a man who was caught up in the third heaven, whether it is in this world or the other world, I do not know, but God knows. My theory also is that Jacob's ladder in the Old Testament is another account of a near-death experience. And I honestly think that Jonah in the whale may be a near-death experience, because I've read all the marine biology reports. There is no creature that can swallow a person without choking on it, okay, and then regurgitate you after 3 days. But perhaps what that is a metaphor of someone that may have drowned, then been brought back, and then resuscitated, and comes forth with this story, and then that's something I'm working on for a presentation. But the Bible records so many factual, so many philosophical, so many spiritual messages. And I think that if we take them as metaphor and as guidance, as opposed to, pun intended, the gospel truth, we're going to be a lot better off.
How old were you when you first read the Bible?
Well, let me see. Probably about 5, because I went to Catholic school, and there's a saying, I saw this recently: if you don't read the Bible, you're Catholic. If you only read the parts you want to justify your behavior, you're a Protestant. And if you read the whole thing, you're an atheist. And I think that that's cynical, but in many cases it could be. But I remember reading it because I was a kid, and the Old Testament, Noah's Ark. I love Noah's Ark. I love that story. And then I remember reading the story of David and Goliath, and I was very much captivated. But the stories about Jesus in particular resonated with me, because he's so symbolic of somebody who's so caring and compassionate and was there to heal, yet they would not listen to him. So a lot of that just so resonated with me.
Book number 8, another classic novel. Many generations have been influenced by this one, Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse, published in 1922. This one comes up quite often.
I'm sure it does. Hermann Hesse, he's a great writer, fantastic. The Steppenwolf was a great book, but Siddhartha, he brings Buddha to life for us. Who was Buddha? Okay, what was he like? What did he go through? And I remember when I was reading that in college, I was walking around like, for like a month after that. The fascinating thing, a lot of people in the West don't understand, are the parallels between Jesus and Buddha. Both came from royal lineage. Jesus from the house of David, Siddhartha was a prince in India, northern India. Both of them left that behind to go on a spiritual quest. Both of them spent 40 some odd days, Jesus 40, and I think Buddha like 44, 45 days in the wilderness. Both were tempted by an evil entity. Jesus tempted by Satan, Siddhartha tempted by Lord Mara, the Lord of Illusion, which is, tomato, tomato. And, once again, looking at that as metaphor, were they really tempted by an evil entity, or is the embodiment of this illusion, of this negativity, the human ego? Think about it. When people do something wrong, something cruel, they're edging God out. They're acting out of ego. And both Jesus and Buddha attained this higher level of consciousness, enlightenment, by forsaking. You see, if Jesus or Buddha had cashed in on their royal lineage, let me see, Jesus going around, I am of the house of David, and really exploited that, he could have lived like a millionaire, but he would not have been on a spiritual path. And the same applies to Siddhartha, which Siddhartha Gautama was the name. Buddha is a state of enlightenment, attaining the Buddha head. So Buddha teaches us that here is the way. Here is the way to the light. And it's a way of living, and it's a way of understanding that suffering is part of our journey, and that without suffering, we do not grow. And we have to see beyond ourself, beyond the human ego, and then that's when you get the bigger picture.
Quite different from book number 9, which is one, you mentioned the author earlier, a woman that we all should be grateful to for opening the doorway, Shirley MacLaine, Out on a Limb.
Yeah, I've loved that book. I've read a number of Shirley's books, but Out on a Limb, I was so excited. Here was a major celebrity, movie star. Okay, I was a kid, and I get this book. My mom was reading. She goes, "Got to read this book," because Mom and I liked Shirley MacLaine. And she went public with her beliefs in psychic phenomenon, UFOs, reincarnation. Boy, did the media go after her, and it didn't matter to her. But I got to tell you something. When Shirley was on the Out on a Limb book promotion tour, she was at the Stouffer Resort in Orlando near SeaWorld, and my mother went. And Mom said that, Shirley was sitting on, the stage, and there's all these psychics and all these people there. And, Shirley had this big status. And on a break, my mom was doing mini readings on people, and all of a sudden the crowd parted. And Shirley walks up to my mother and says, "So I hear you're the woman that I should get a reading from." So my mom did a reading on Shirley MacLaine, And so I was asking Mom, afterwards, "Well, what'd you tell her?" She goes, "Well, Mark, that's between Shirley and me." All right. So let's fast forward, years later, and I'm on tour in Buffalo. I was speaking at a Unity Church in Buffalo, and I was going to be a keynote speaker at the Lilydale in Lilydale, and we get a call from this radio show called Independent Expressions. And my manager, Rocky's like, "Seriously?" She goes, "Mark, Shirley MacLaine's radio show is on the phone, and she wants to interview you right now." And I'm like, "Oh my God." So here I am on the phone with Shirley MacLaine. And it was supposed to be a 20-minute interview. It ended up being 2 hours and 40 minutes because she goes, "You know so much about me." I said, "Oh God, I've been a big fan." I was talking about her movies and stuff, and we got into some really beautiful philosophical discussions. And somehow or other, Stephen Hawking was still alive, and I mentioned something about, we were talking about quantum physics, and I brought up Stephen Hawking. And she said, "Well, I was in Stephen's office, and he's a friend of mine." And she says, "What people don't understand is he really does believe in God, just not in the traditional sense." And she said, "So I'm in Stephen's office, and there's these 2 pictures behind his desk, one of Albert Einstein and one of Marilyn Monroe." And I said, "Stephen, I get Einstein, but why Marilyn? And then she imitates him. She goes, because her curves are more beautiful than a quantum singularity. So I'm laughing. And I said, wow, did you ever meet Marilyn Monroe? She goes, yes, I did. And I didn't realize it, but Shirley, I didn't, she said that Marilyn and I were up for the same parts all the time. And the studios used to play us off on one another. In fact, at John F. Kennedy's birthday celebration, the one where Marilyn comes out in that dress and it goes, happy birthday. She said, well, Marilyn threw a fit backstage and said, I'm not putting on that dress and I'm not doing this. And Shirley MacLaine was there that night because she was part of the Rat Pack. And Frank Sinatra was there, and Peter Lawford was JFK's brother-in-law, and Shirley was there. And one of the producers said, that's okay, Shirley MacLaine's here. She's your size. She can fit into the dress. So Marilyn says, fine, I'll do it. And so Marilyn said that it was really cruel the way the studios would play us off on each other, and because we were up for a lot of the same roles. And she said, and then I got the role in the movie The Apartment. And that's what catapulted Shirley MacLaine to from like B movie to A-list status. And she said, so there I am at the premiere of The Apartment in Los Angeles. It's a red carpet event. Marilyn Monroe shows up wearing a full-length fur coat. And Marilyn says, and everyone's like, God, it's really hot tonight. What's up with Marilyn? So halfway through the movie, Marilyn gets up and goes out to the lobby. And Shirley goes out there to say, Marilyn, is there a problem? And Marilyn was at the bar, and she turned to Shirley MacLaine. All right, we're on the air. Okay, Sandie, we're on the air. This is being broadcast. And she said, Marilyn opens this fur coat, and she's stark naked underneath it. And then Shirley MacLaine says, now that I think of it, Stephen had a point. And I said, wow, I wonder what Marilyn Monroe would say about that. And she goes, well, you're the medium. You tell me. And I'm like, oh my God, talk about pressure. And so I'm like, okay. And I'm like, all right, I'm calming down, coming down. I'm opening my brain to the afterlife frequency, calming down. And then all of a sudden, Marilyn Monroe comes through. And the message that I delivered, she said, did Marilyn kill herself? And the answer was no, that she was very depressed. And she said that I was always jealous of you, Shirley, because you could walk through a crowd with such grace and elegance. And I always felt so garish and uncomfortable. And Shirley said, well, that is exactly something Marilyn would say. And then the next message was, and thank you for taking the high road. And she goes, oh my gosh. She said, Mark, now I know this is Marilyn, because after Marilyn died, she was a movie she was working on, and they wanted me to take over and just redo it. And she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And then it dawned on me, Sandie, that I am on the phone doing a reading for Shirley MacLaine while I'm communicating with the spirit of Marilyn Monroe. And then it gets even better, because I go, there's somebody else here. She's got the most beautiful eyes. Oh my God. She goes, oh, Liz. Liz was my best friend. She was so nice to me. And I'm like, I'm talking to Shirley MacLaine while I'm communicating with Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. And the thing is, Sandie, I don't think I'm ever going to top that one. But I also, it dawned on me after that both my mother and I have done a reading for Shirley MacLaine. And so when she came out this week, I'm getting choked up here, and recommended my book, that's one of the greatest honors of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you tell Shirley that your mother had done a reading for her?
I did. And she said, well, I remember the tour. And I go, and I still want to know what she told you. And she goes, well, that would be between your mother and I.
Same answer.
But you know, she really did go out on a limb, and I appreciate you indulging me. I know it's a lengthy story, but it made me feel so good, because I asked her, I said, what about all the attacks? I go, because I get them too. People tell me, oh, you're doing the work of Satan and you're making this up and blah, blah, blah. She goes, Mark, none of that matters. What matters is the work that you're doing. And she said, I never let it bother me because I was true to myself and my feelings. And I know what I'm doing is good and it is right. And so that's one of the many reasons that I selected that book, because she is an example to all of us who are pursuing not just the spiritual path, but your passion.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely, I agree with you. Okay, so the last book, now this one's been described by a reviewer as one of the best books ever written, Creation by Gore Vidal.
It's a magnificent book. In some ways, I don't want to say it's like Michener, because Gore Vidal has his own style. And what I love about this book, once again, a historical novel, but it reads really, really well. And it also incorporates theology and philosophy. Zoroastrianism at one time was the world's most influential religion because it was the official religion of the Persian Empire, the mighty Persian Empire that stretched from, just north of Greece all the way to India. And so the main character is, he's fictional, but he's supposed to be the grandson of Zoroaster. And he is the ambassador, one of the ambassadors of the Persian king. And throughout the book, he encounters, Plato, Socrates in the West. And then he travels east and goes to India and encounters Buddha as a very old man. And then he journeys to China and encounters Confucius. So throughout the book, you get it's sort of the who's who of 5th century BC spirituality and philosophy. You get everyone from the greats and Plato, Socrates. You get understanding Zoroaster. Then you get Buddha. Then you get Confucius, and certainly political leaders of the day like Cyrus the Great. And it was interesting the way they describe Cyrus, and then I think it's his son Darius the Second, and eventually it was Darius the Third, who is the Persian emperor who tried to conquer Greece. There were two. There was Darius and then his son Xerxes that both invaded Greece, and the Greeks were able to defeat them. And I just loved the way this book, and Gore Vidal does such a wonderful job with his research of understanding the philosophy, the history of that time. Because let's face it, think about it. Confucius, in some ways, still affects China to this day. The Maoists initially were trying to purge Confucius, but now there's a bit of a revivalism of the philosophy of Confucius, Kung Fu Zu in Chinese, in China, Buddha, certainly to this day, Zoroastrianism. You know who the most famous Zoroastrian that we probably know is?
Freddie Mercury.
You got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't understand that. Recently, what a lot of people don't understand is that the Zoroastrians were very much in the news for a very sad reason. A couple years ago, that horrible organization ISIS, they were committing genocide against the Yazidi people. The Yazidis were Zoroastrians. They were rounding it. They probably slaughtered 500,000, maybe more, of these people simply because of their beliefs. And Zoroastrianism is about balance, the balance between light and dark. And if you think about it, perhaps it influenced yin yang, where there's light, there's dark, there's masculine, there's feminine, there's positive, there's negative. This is the nature of the universe. We look at it on a quantum level. There's positive energy, there's negative energy. And so Gore Vidal does such a beautiful job of pulling all of this together in a very, very compelling read.
There was a quote by a reviewer in the New York Times who said about this book, there isn't a page of creation that doesn't inform, and very few pages that do not delight.
Yes.
One to put on my list. Okay, so that is your 10 books. What are you reading now?
I just received a book from Helping Parents Heal, and it is about life after. I've got it. I just received it the other day, and it's about helping parents cope with the loss of a child. And so that's what I'm reading now. But I've always got something going. I've always got, something going. But I have to be honest, at this point in time, I'm so focused on the promotion for this book.
Yeah.
And I'm still writing. I'm a columnist for Best Holistic Life magazine. And also I did write an article for Ohm Times, which is in the October version. Edition. But I'm writing a book now about parents who have connected with their children in spirit, and how the spirit communication is an important therapeutic step in the journey through grief. And I do a lot of work with Helping Parents Heal. I do spirit communication events with them, and I'm very honored to be associated with this beautiful organization.
It is a beautiful organization, indeed. Yeah. So let's talk about the Afterlife Frequency. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it is a book that I rate very highly indeed, and I love the science in it. And what's so interesting is I think that we are really ready now to have a book like this, because you suddenly see out there in the mainstream, I don't know if you saw it, but apparently there was a news item I saw that people on TikTok are freaking out after a woman called Jolie Moley suggested we may never really die, but instead our consciousness goes into an alternate reality where we exist without the memories of the world we lived in prior, except for a few details. Now, people are going crazy, and people are getting very, very scared at the thought of this, which I found really interesting, because I like to look at what is happening as a kind of, it's like a reflection of what we're ready for. And I think the world is ready right now to have this conversation explode.
Yeah, the TikTok video, the thing is, she's half right. When we leave this world, one of the key things that I do in the Afterlife Frequency is introduce new terminology.
Yeah.
To bring, first off, mediumship is out of the Victorian era into the 21st century. And the electromagnetic soul is one of my key theories. And the reason that I came up with this term is we know from faith that the soul, the spirit, consciousness pre-exists the body, comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. That's the basic tenet of all the major religions. We know from the laws of thermodynamics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. We know from neuroscience that the brain has an electrical field. We know that there are 5 different forms of brainwave frequencies. We know that on the subatomic level, you go from molecules to atoms to electrons, protons, and neutrons to the smallest particle, quantum, which is electromagnetic energy. Everything in the material world dimension at the most basic level is electromagnetic energy. So I came up with the term electromagnetic soul to describe who and what we really are, which is pure consciousness that is eternal electromagnetic energy. We don't die. The thing is, think of your brain as a drop of water. And when we die, the EMS, the electromagnetic soul, plunges into this eternal sea of consciousness, the collective consciousness. But unlike TikTok lady, we maintain our memories, our feelings, who and what we are, our individuality. Why do I know this? I have done over 15,000 readings and communicated with well over 100,000 spirits in my life, and they remember who they are. Okay. And I've been tested in laboratories in California, in the University of Arizona, and in the UK. And spirits are eternal beings. And the reason I came up with the electromagnetic soul is because it combines faith and science. In fact, couple of scientists, in particular, Dr. Gary Schwartz, who wrote the foreword for the Afterlife Frequency, said, Mark, I love it. He said, 20 years ago, I was trying to come up with a term to explain this phenomenon, and I called it the electromagnetic dynamical mind-body interface. He goes, you nailed it. Electromagnetic soul. I'm using it. EMS. And I said, thank you. I'm honored. So that is one of the key concepts that I introduce in the book. And by understanding the EMS, that's the building block for understanding not just what happens when we die, but near-death experiences, shared death experiences, deathbed visions, visitations from a spirit, and contact with spirits through a medium.
So tell me, if we remember everything, presumably from the most recent life, what about the previous lives? Is there a part of us that kind of re-engages and remembers all of those as well?
Well, this is one of the topics that I discuss in my lecture on the science of reincarnation, and that I go into in my previous book, Evidence of Eternity. Here's how I describe it. We're multi-dimensional beings, because through quantum entanglement, even though the EMS is in our brain, the energy is connected, okay? And it would take more time than we have to explain this. That's why people should read the Afterlife Frequency to explain this. But think of, people call it your higher self. So we're connected to this collective consciousness. Think of this higher self component as a librarian, okay? Since we're doing a book club, all right? We're in the No BS book club. And that you're in your various incarnations, you were once in Anne Frank, you were once in War and Peace, you were once in The Godfather, you were once in, Huckleberry Finn. Okay. Now, the librarian knows who all these characters are, but the characters don't necessarily know or recognize each other. So let's say that Anne Frank has passed and you want to do a reading through a medium to communicate with her, but now she's reincarnated as Michael Corleone from The Godfather. All right. Well, we're still capable of communicating with that aspect of her because we're contacting the collective consciousness, the afterlife frequency, and the higher self retains those memories. Because I get a lot of people say, well, I don't want to believe in reincarnation because what if I go there and my loved one's not there? It's like, you can't worry about stuff like that. We're dealing with something so much farther beyond that. So we never lose who we are or who we were, even if there's damage to the brain, like people who are in a severe state of dementia, Alzheimer's, brain cancer. And I go into this very heavily in the chapter on the EMS in the Afterlife Frequency.
The book is filled with stories, encounters that you've had. Some of them are just unbelievable. There's one I'd like you to share with us because this was a group experience, and it occurred with a number of firemen who were the hotshots. Tell us just briefly, because we will be running out of time soon, a little bit about that story.
The hotshots, okay, the criticism of an NDE, a near-death experience, is that it's subjective. And once again, in the book, I go through what the skeptics' arguments are, and I refute all of those. And the new frontier, as in afterlife research, as coined by Dr. Jeffrey Long from the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, and he's also a friend and colleague, are shared death experiences. This is where more than one person has the same experience. And this is where an NDE goes from being subjective to objective and proof that these are real. Hotshots are the elite forces, if you will, of firefighters. It's like maybe 20 to 22 men and women that are super highly trained, and they're put in the most dangerous fires. And Jose, there was a guy named Jose, and then there was a guy whose last name was Hernandez. They were a hotshot team, and they were dropped onto a mountaintop fire. And mountain weather is very tricky. The wind changes direction quickly, and all of a sudden, the wind changed direction, started heading right at them. Well, these super trained guys, and the fire was moving at 100 miles per hour, and trees were exploding. They hit the ground, put protective gear over them. The flames engulfed them. Hernandez realizes he's suffocating because the fire has sucked all the oxygen out of the air. And he's thinking, I'm dying, this is it. And the next thing he knows, he's hovering above the mountain. And he looks around and he sees all the other hot shots hovering above the mountain. And Jose, who I mentioned earlier, had a deformed foot, but he was seeing Jose with a perfectly formed foot. And he said, Jose, your foot. And Jose's like, yeah, my foot's okay. And he realized they weren't talking, they were telepathically communicating. And then he said, then the next thing he knows, he went into this white light and he was encountering people he knew that who had died, including his great grandfather, whom he was very close to. And his great grandfather said, you have to go back. I'm paraphrasing, And so the next thing he knows, he's on the ground. He's in horrible pain. He pulls the protective gear off of him. The mountaintop is charred to a crisp. He cannot understand how or why he's alive. And then he looks around and he sees all the other hot shots emerging as well. And they all gather at the top of the mountain and they start talking. Every one of them had the same experience. Every one of them left their body. Every one of them saw each other. Every one of them saw Jose with a perfectly formed foot. Why? Because spirits, the EMS, is pure energy. Energy doesn't get sick, old, tired, or die. Every one of them encountered deceased loved ones, their loved ones in the light. Now, how can that be if this is just a side effect of the dying brain? How can this be if it's simply a hallucination? How can this be? Because it's real.
Yeah, good questions. So briefly before we close, tell people what they're going to find in this book.
This book is for anyone who wants a greater understanding of spirit communication. This book is not about turning you into a medium, but instead teaching you how to recognize, accept, feel, and trust messages from the various forms of spirit communication to get the most out of it. This book is for anyone coping with the loss of a loved one, for parents who've lost a child, for people coping with post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt. And this book, my life's mission, Sandie, and is through all my books, but in particularly this one, is to help people understand a 5-point message that the divine power that we can call God exists, that our EMS, our soul, is an immortal living being, that the afterlife, nirvana, heaven, whatever you want to call it, exists, that we can communicate with souls, and that we'll be reunited with our loved ones when it is our time to leave this material world.
Mark Anthony, thank you for sharing the information about your book, and thank you for adding your list of spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's archive. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be on your show. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Mark Anthony's latest book, The Afterlife Frequency, The Scientific Proof of Spiritual Contact and How That Awareness Will Change Your Life, is published by New World Library and is available as paperback on Audible and on Kindle. And you can find more about the book at the website is theafterlifefrequency.com. Is that correct?
Yes, afterlifefrequency.com.
Okay, and you can see all the videos in this series on the video page at the No BS Spiritual Book Club.com, where you can sign up to be the first to know who's coming up next. And while you're there, if you know you have a book in you, but you don't know where to start, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be the catalyst you've been looking for. That brings us to the end of this week's show, which, by the way, will also be available as a podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Audible, Amazon, iHeartRadio, you name it, it will be there. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and in case you haven't guessed it, books are my passion, my love, my life. And I'll be back next week with another episode of the No BS Spiritual Book Club's 10 Best Spiritual Books interviews. Till then, it's goodbye from me.